After living in my house rent-free for 8 long years, my daughter and her husband won a $95 million lottery. That very night, with the winning ticket trembling in his hand, my son-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "Pack your bags, old man. Get out of my house tonight. This place is mine now." My own daughter stood right behind him, silently staring at the floor. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply took a slow sip of my black coffee, smiled, and asked him one single question. A question that made his smug face turn to pure ash. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, a retired structural engineer, and a widower. Before I tell you the rest of this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand your ground against family members who mistook your kindness for weakness. It helps me share these life lessons with people who need to hear them. To understand how I ended up staring down my own flesh and blood in my own kitchen, you have to understand the ground we were standing on. I built this house on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, 40 years ago. I poured the foundation. I framed the walls. I laid the hardwood floors with my own 2 hands. My late wife, Patricia, and I filled these rooms with love, warmth, and the kind of quiet stability that money simply cannot buy. When Patricia passed away 5 years ago, a massive part of my soul went with her. The house felt too big, too quiet, but it was my sanctuary. It was the only place where I could still hear her laughter in the echoes of the empty hallways. 3 years before Patricia died, which makes it 8 years ago today, my daughter Melanie and her husband Derek came to us with a desperate plea. They were struggling. Rent in Austin was skyrocketing. The real estate market was becoming a vicious bubble, and they claimed they were drowning in expenses. Derek, a man who always wore suits that were a little too sharp and watches he could not afford, sat at my dining table and practically begged. He swore that if we just let them move into our guest wing for 1 or 2 years, they could save up a massive down payment for a house of their own. Patricia, with her endless well of compassion, immediately agreed. I was hesitant. I had spent 40 years in the cutthroat commercial construction business, dealing with ruthless contractors, shady suppliers, and men who would smile warmly at you while reaching deep into your pocket. I knew a parasite when I saw one. Derek had the smooth talk of a salesman, but the calloused hands of a man who had never done a hard day of work in his life. But Melanie was my little girl. I looked at her hopeful eyes, and against my better judgment, I opened my doors. 1 or 2 years quickly mutated into 8. The temporary arrangement became a permanent occupation. They did not save for a house. Instead, I watched my house slowly transform into a luxury hotel for 2 adults who refused to grow up. I paid the property taxes. I paid the skyrocketing utility bills. I covered the homeowner's insurance and even the weekly groceries. I let them live entirely expense-free, shielding them from the harsh realities of the economy so they could supposedly build a rock-solid foundation for their future. But month after month, year after year, I watched Derek buy expensive golf clubs, top-tier electronics, and tailored clothing. Whenever I brought up their savings plan, Derek would smoothly deflect, claiming his money was tied up in complex, high-yield investments that would pay off massively any day now. Melanie would rush to his defense, telling me that Derek was a financial visionary and that I just did not understand modern wealth management. I kept my mouth shut. I kept the peace, but the peace ended tonight. It was a Tuesday evening. The Mega Millions jackpot had been dominating the news cycle, swelling to a staggering $95 million. I was sitting at the massive oak kitchen island, nursing a hot mug of decaf coffee, quietly reviewing some old architectural blueprints under the pendant lights, just to keep my aging mind sharp. Derek burst through the front door like a hurricane. His face was flushed red, his chest heaving. He was clutching a small slip of paper as if his life depended on it. Melanie ran in right behind him, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged energy. Derek slammed his hands onto the granite countertop, the very countertop I had sourced and installed for Patricia decades ago. He shoved his phone into my face, displaying the winning numbers from the live broadcast, and then held up his ticket. The numbers matched. Every single one of them. $95 million. For a brief second, I felt a surge of relief for them. I thought finally they have their money. Finally, they can buy their mansion, leave my home, and let me live out my remaining years in peace. I was about to offer my congratulations. I was about to smile. But Derek did not want congratulations. Wealth, sudden and massive, acts like a truth serum. It strips away the polite masks people wear and reveals the rotting core beneath. Derek did not celebrate with me. He stood up straight, puffed out his chest, and looked down at me with a sneer of pure, unfiltered contempt. All the fake respect, all the forced politeness he had manufactured for 8 years vanished in a single breath. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face, his breathing heavy with adrenaline. His voice was loud, arrogant, and dripping with venom. "Pack your bags, old man. Get out of my house tonight." I froze. The words hung in the air, echoing off the custom cabinets. I looked at him, genuinely wondering if the shock of the money had induced a psychotic break. "Excuse me," I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "You heard me," Derek barked, stepping closer. "You are a pathetic burden. I am sick of living under your roof, pretending to care about your outdated rules. I am a multimillionaire now. I do not need you. I do not need your charity. In fact, I am taking this house. You can consider it back pay for having to deal with you all these years. Get your things and get out." I slowly turned my gaze to Melanie. My daughter. The little girl I had read bedtime stories to. The woman I had protected and sheltered. She was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She refused to look me in the eye. "Melanie," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Are you going to stand there and let this man throw your father out onto the street, in the house your mother and I built for you?" She shifted her weight awkwardly, looking at the floor tiles. "Dad, it is Derek's money now. We are practically billionaires. We do not want you ruining our celebration with your negative energy. Just pack a bag. We will call a premium ride service to take you to a nice motel. We will send you some cash next week once the funds clear." The betrayal was absolute. It was a physical pain in my chest, a cold blade twisting right where my heart used to beat for them. They had consumed my resources, eaten my food, lived under my protection for 8 years, and the very second they believed they had power, their first instinct was to discard me like trash. I did not yell. I did not flip the table. A seasoned engineer knows that when a structure is fundamentally flawed, you do not waste energy pushing against it. You simply find the load-bearing pillar and pull it out. I picked up my coffee mug. The ceramic was warm against my palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter liquid slide down my throat. The silence in the kitchen stretched thick and suffocating. Derek's arrogant smile began to falter just slightly under my unwavering gaze. I set the mug down with a soft, definitive click. "Before I go upstairs and pack my bags, Derek," I said, my voice steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear, "I just want you to answer one simple question." Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes. "What do you want to know? If I will buy you a retirement condo?" "Forget it." "No," I replied, leaning forward just an inch. "I want to know exactly which credit card you swiped at the gas station to buy that specific lottery ticket." Derek frowned, annoyed by the irrelevance of the question. "I used my black corporate card, the Apex card. Why do you care, old man? The money belongs to my company." I smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a wolf watching a rabbit step willingly into a steel jaw trap. I watched the realization slowly creeping into his eyes, watched the triumphant flush drain from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. "Because, Derek," I said softly, "that corporate card changes absolutely everything." To understand the absolute terror that paralyzed Derek when I mentioned that corporate credit card, you have to understand the dynamic he had established in my home. You need to rewind to a few months prior to that fateful lottery night. It was late spring, and Central Texas was being battered by a series of relentless, unforgiving thunderstorms. The sky over Austin turned a bruised, violent purple, and the rain came down in heavy sheets that tested the integrity of every house in the neighborhood. The rain washed away the topsoil I had meticulously cultivated, stripping the yard bare, a fitting metaphor for what was happening inside my own walls. It was a miserable gray week that seemed entirely determined to ruin the meticulously manicured aesthetic of our normally pristine suburban enclave. My house, however, was built to withstand almost anything. I designed it that way. Every beam, every joist, every single shingle was selected for endurance. But no amount of structural engineering can protect a home from pure, unadulterated arrogance. 2 weeks before the severe storms began, Derek had decided he absolutely needed a specific foreign sports programming package on satellite television. Instead of hiring a professional installer or simply asking for my help, he insisted on doing it himself. He climbed onto the roof with a heavy power drill and absolutely zero understanding of roofing membranes. He drilled heavy lag bolts directly through the protective moisture barrier, completely shattering the waterproof seal. I warned him while he was up there. I stood on the lawn and told him that water always finds a way, that you cannot pierce a roof without proper sealant. He just waved me off, adjusting his expensive watch, telling me that his firm's facility management team had taught him how to handle basic logistics. He treated my warning like the rambling of an obsolete old man. When the massive storm finally hit, the water did exactly what I said it would do. It found a way. It poured through the compromised shingles, seeped deep into the attic insulation, and completely destroyed the drywall ceiling in the guest wing hallway. The water poured down the walls, ruining the custom paint job Patricia had chosen years ago. The damage was significant. I called a trusted roofing contractor I had worked with for decades. He assessed the water damage, the ruined insulation, and the fractured drywall. He handed me the estimate on a damp clipboard. The total came out to exactly $4,000. It was a steep price to pay for a few hours of television programming, but that is the reality of home ownership. You break it, you fix it. That evening, I sat at the dining table with the itemized invoice resting flat on the mahogany surface. Derek was pacing around the kitchen, aggressively typing on his phone and loudly complaining about the noise the industrial dehumidifiers were making in the hallway. He was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, preparing for some supposedly high-stakes networking dinner downtown. He looked like a man who owned the world, while I sat there holding the bill for his careless mistake. I called him over. I kept my voice steady, treating him not like an errant child, but like an adult tenant sharing a living space. I explained the extent of the water damage. I detailed exactly how his amateur drilling had caused the severe leak. I did not ask him to cover the entire cost, even though the fault was entirely his. I simply asked him to split the bill with me, $2,000 each. A fair and reasonable compromise for a mistake that threatened the structural integrity of the house. Derek stopped typing on his phone. He looked down at the invoice, then looked at me, letting out a long, heavy sigh. It was a sound designed to make me feel like a massive inconvenience. He slowly adjusted his silk tie and leaned against the granite counter, giving me the kind of condescending, tight-lipped smile a senior banker gives a confused customer. Richard. He began, his tone dripping with patronizing patience. You have to understand that the Austin real estate market is absolutely crazy right now. Every liquid dollar I have is strategically positioned. My capital is tied up in a high-yield tech fund that is about to go public. Pulling $2,000 out right now would trigger severe early withdrawal penalties and disrupt my entire investment portfolio. It is just bad business. I will pay you back next quarter when my quarterly dividends finally mature. It was a beautifully constructed lie. It sounded sophisticated, urgent, and perfectly reasonable to anyone who did not understand how finance actually works. But I knew better. I knew that successful men do not live in their father-in-law's guest room for 8 years while bragging about high-yield tech funds. Before I could even respond to that wall of financial jargon, Melanie walked into the kitchen. She had heard the entire exchange from the hallway. My daughter, the little girl I had taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway, the woman whose college tuition I had paid in full, walked right past me and stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband. "Dad," she said, her voice laced with a weary disappointment that cut me straight to the bone. "Derek is working so hard for our future. He is out there every single day grinding to build a beautiful life for us. You know how stressful his job is right now. You have plenty of retirement savings just sitting in the bank. You own this massive house free and clear. Please just help us out this one time. Why do you always have to make everything so difficult?" The room fell dead silent. I looked at Melanie. I looked at the man who was bleeding my resources dry while wearing a tailored suit. They stood united, a united front of entitlement and disrespect. They were not asking for a favor. They were demanding a subsidy. They had convinced themselves that my wealth was their birthright, and that my concerns were just the complaints of a bitter old man. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or demand respect. I simply picked up the invoice, folded it neatly, and placed it in my shirt pocket. I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said quietly. "I will take care of it." Derek offered a smug, victorious smile. "Thanks, Richard. I appreciate you being reasonable about this." He grabbed his keys and walked out the door to his networking dinner, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my daughter, who quickly avoided my gaze and retreated to her room. I paid the $4,000 bill in silence the very next morning. I swallowed the disrespect, convincing myself that maintaining family harmony was worth the financial sacrifice. I told myself that perhaps Derek really was on the verge of a massive financial breakthrough, and that soon they would finally leave my home. But the illusion of his financial struggle shattered completely, just 24 hours later. The very next afternoon, I was standing on the front porch, inspecting the newly repaired roof shingles. The sky had finally cleared, leaving a bright, sunny Texas afternoon. I heard the deep, aggressive roar of a high-performance engine echoing down my quiet suburban street. I watched as Derek pulled into my driveway. He did not pull in driving his usual sensible sedan. He pulled into my driveway in a brand-new, gleaming, black $80,000 Porsche Macan. The polished rims caught the sunlight, reflecting a blinding glare that mocked my restraint. He stepped out of the driver's seat, adjusted his designer sunglasses, and smiled. I walked down the steps, my eyes locked on the gleaming black paint of the Porsche Macan. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Derek leaned against the driver's side door, looking entirely too pleased with himself. He offered that same condescending smile he had given me the night before over the $4,000 repair bill. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Derek asked, patting the roof of the vehicle. "German engineering at its absolute finest." I stopped a few feet away, waiting. "It is a very nice car, Derek. It looks like a very expensive car, especially for a man who could not afford to pay $2,000 for his own roof repairs just 24 hours ago." He let out a dismissive laugh. "Richard, you are looking at this all wrong. I did not buy this car. This is a company lease. My financial firm provides these vehicles to top-performing executives to project an image of success to our high-net-worth clients. I do not pay a dime for it." It was a smooth answer, delivered with absolute confidence. But my intuition, honed by 40 years of navigating the cutthroat world of commercial construction, immediately screamed that he was lying. In my line of work, you learn to read people quickly. Derek had the unmistakable posture of a man who was deeply overextended and desperately trying to cover his tracks. A legitimate financial firm does not hand out $80,000 luxury SUVs to mid-level employees who live in their father-in-law's guest room. It simply made no sense. I did not push the issue. I simply nodded, told him to park it carefully, and walked back inside the house. I knew that arguing with a liar only makes them build a better fortress around their lies. Instead, I decided to step back and watch his habits. I needed to see what else he was hiding. My observation period did not take long to yield bizarre results. 3 days later, I walked down to the end of my driveway to retrieve the morning mail. I had performed this simple routine every single morning for 4 decades. But that morning I found a massive, heavy-duty brass padlock clamped tightly through the latch of my vintage brick mailbox. I stood there for a moment, genuinely confused. I walked back up to the house and found Derek in the kitchen, casually sipping an espresso. I asked him why my mailbox was locked like a maximum security vault. Derek did not even blink. "Oh, I meant to tell you about that, Richard. We had a security briefing at the firm yesterday. Apparently, suburban identity theft is skyrocketing in this part of Austin. Criminals are driving through neighborhoods and stealing financial statements right out of unlocked mailboxes. With the amount of sensitive corporate documents I receive from my tech fund management, I had to secure the perimeter. It is for your own good, really." "Give me the spare key, Derek," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "This is my house. I need access to my own mail." He gave me a look of practiced sympathy. "I would love to, Richard, but the security protocol dictates that only the primary account holder maintains access. But do not worry about it. I will handle the mail collection from now on. You can just relax and enjoy your retirement." From that day forward, Derek took absolute control of the mailbox. I noticed he began waking up at 5 in the morning, long before the sun even rose, waiting by the front window for the postal carrier to arrive. The moment the mail truck pulled away, Derek would march down the driveway, unlock the heavy brass padlock, retrieve the stack of envelopes, and quickly lock it back up. He would then sort through the mail in his car, bringing me only the mundane utility bills and junk mail. He was controlling the flow of information into my own home. It was not about suburban identity theft. It was an information quarantine. He was desperately terrified of something arriving in that mailbox, something he absolutely could not afford for me to see. My unease grew into a sharp, constant alarm. I knew I had to bypass his quarantine, but I needed to wait for him to make a mistake. Arrogant men always make mistakes. They become complacent in their own perceived brilliance. The opportunity finally presented itself on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Derek had been pacing the living room all morning, aggressively texting someone on his phone. His usual polished demeanor was cracking, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. Around 1 o'clock, his phone rang. He answered it, his face turning pale. He muttered a quick, panicked agreement into the receiver, hung up, and grabbed his keys. "I have an emergency meeting downtown," he shouted to Melanie, who was reading a magazine on the sofa. "I will be back late." He bolted out the front door, leaving a trail of expensive cologne in his wake. He was in such a frantic rush that he completely forgot his tailored gray suit jacket draped over the back of the dining room chair. I waited until I heard the heavy engine of his leased Porsche roar down the street and fade into the distance. I walked into the dining room and stood next to the chair. I looked at Melanie. She was completely absorbed in her magazine, paying absolutely no attention to me or the jacket. I reached out and picked up the garment. As I lifted it, a thick, crumpled envelope slipped out from the interior breast pocket and landed on the hardwood floor with a soft thud. I bent down and picked it up. It had already been torn open, the jagged edge showing how hastily Derek had accessed it. The return address in the top left corner did not belong to a high-yield tech fund or a sophisticated corporate investment firm. It belonged to a predatory, high-risk credit agency known for issuing subprime loans. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I slid the folded documents out of the envelope. It was a final collection notice. The bright red ink across the top of the page screamed of impending legal action and severe financial penalties. But it was not the red ink that made my blood run completely cold. It was the name printed right below the final warning. The credit card was not in Derek's name. It was in Melanie's name, my daughter's name. I scanned down to the total balance due, expecting to see a few $1,000s of neglected spending. The number printed at the bottom of the statement hit me with the force of a physical blow. $85,000. $85,000 in high interest, unsecured credit card debt accumulated completely under my daughter's identity, hidden away in a jacket pocket inside my own home. This was a catastrophic mountain of debt, and Derek had been intercepting the mail every morning, to ensure I never saw the warning signs. I carefully folded the heavy, menacing sheet of paper exactly along its original creases. My hands were perfectly steady, a trait I had mastered over 4 decades of steadying structural beams and drafting precise architectural blueprints. I slipped the collection notice back into the envelope, tucked it deep inside the breast pocket of Derek's tailored jacket, and draped the garment over the back of the dining room chair exactly as I had found it. I did not confront Melanie. I did not storm into the living room and demand an explanation for the $85,000 of hidden high-interest debt that she and her husband were desperately concealing. A good engineer knows that when you discover a critical stress fracture in a foundation, you do not immediately start swinging a sledgehammer. You map out the entire structural failure first, because if you strike blindly, the whole building will collapse on top of you. I spent the rest of that evening playing the part of the oblivious, compliant father. When Derek returned from his supposed emergency meeting downtown, smelling faintly of expensive bourbon rather than the stale coffee of a boardroom, I simply nodded and asked how his investments were performing. He flashed that practiced artificial smile, assuring me that his tech fund was outperforming all market projections. I smiled back, listening to the hollow cadence of his lies. Melanie served dinner, avoiding my gaze, her movements stiff and nervous. The tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a drywall saw, but I remained an absolute portrait of calm. I ate my meal, complimented her cooking, and excused myself to my bedroom early, claiming the exhaustion of an old man. But sleep was an absolute impossibility. I lay in the dark, staring up at the ceiling fan, my mind racing through a maze of horrific possibilities. Why would Derek intercept the mail to hide Melanie's debt? Why did she allow him to maintain such an iron grip on their finances? If they were $85,000 in the hole to a predatory lending agency, how are they continuing to afford luxury leased vehicles and constant deliveries of designer clothing? The math was completely broken. There was a massive bleeding hole in their financial ledger, and my gut told me that the rot went far deeper than a single credit card. At exactly 2 a.m, a deep, pervasive thirst pulled me out of my restless thoughts. The house was supposed to be completely silent, wrapped in the heavy, suffocating stillness of the Texas suburban night. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress, my joints aching with a dull, familiar pain, and quietly stepped out into the hallway. I did not turn on any lights. I knew every inch of this house by heart. I knew which floorboards creaked and which ones were entirely silent because I was the man who had hammered the nails into them 40 years ago. As I approached the top of the main staircase, I heard it. Hushed, frantic whispers drifting up from the kitchen below. I stopped holding my breath, pressing my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. The light from the kitchen island cast long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor of the foyer. I crept down the stairs, placing my weight only on the edges of the steps, moving with the absolute silence of a ghost in my own home. Melanie was crying. It was not the gentle, manipulative weeping she used to extract favors from me. It was a raw, breathless sobbing, the kind of panic that comes from genuine, inescapable terror. "You promised me we were safe, Derek," she gasped, her voice trembling so violently I could barely make out the words. "You promised me nobody would ever find out. What happens if the collection agency calls the house line? What happens if Dad answers the phone? If Dad checks the county property records, we are completely finished. He will never forgive us for this." The mention of county property records hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Credit card debt is handled by banks and private lenders. County property records deal with real estate. They deal with deeds, land titles, and property ownership. Why in God's name would my daughter be terrified of me checking the county property records? Derek hissed, cutting her off with a sharp, vicious tone that I had never heard him use before. It was a voice completely stripped of the charming corporate facade he wore during the day. It was the voice of a cornered, ruthless predator. "Keep your voice down," he snapped, pacing aggressively across the kitchen tiles. "The old man is completely clueless. He spends all day puttering around the garden, and reading old magazines. He is never going to check the county records because he has no reason to suspect anything is wrong. I handled the paperwork perfectly. I slipped the transfer documents right in with his hospital proxy forms last month. He barely even looked at them. He signs whatever I tell him to sign. I stood frozen in the shadows, my blood turning to ice in my veins. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violent, terrifying rhythm. I squeezed my eyes shut as the horrifying memory crashed over me with absolute clarity. 3 months ago, I had contracted a severe case of pneumonia. It hit me hard, leaving me weak, feverish, and practically bedridden for 2 entire weeks. My lungs had felt like they were filled with wet cement. During the worst of the illness, when I was heavily medicated on prescription painkillers and struggling to breathe, Derek had come into my bedroom. He was wearing his usual tailored suit, holding a silver pen and a thick stack of legal documents. He had spoken to me in a soft, deeply concerned voice, telling me that the hospital needed updated medical proxy forms and emergency contact authorizations just in case my condition deteriorated. I was exhausted. I was vulnerable. I trusted my daughter's husband to protect my interests. I had taken the silver pen and signed my name on the dotted lines wherever he had pointed, never once demanding to read the fine print. Once the collateral loan clears next Friday, Derek continued, his voice dripping with a sickening, triumphant venom. We take the cash, pay off your stupid credit card debt, and cover my margin calls. Then we quietly put him in a cheap nursing home across town. We will tell him the house is too much for him to maintain. He will be out of our way, and this entire property will legally belong to us, free and clear. Do not ruin this for me, Melanie. Just keep your mouth shut and keep playing the devoted daughter for 5 more days. I stopped breathing. The darkness of the hallway seemed to close in around me, suffocating and absolute. My own daughter. My own flesh and blood, the child Patricia and I had sacrificed everything to raise, had stood silently by, while her husband orchestrated the complete theft of my life's work. She knew. She had known the entire time that Derek was plotting to steal the house right out from under me, to drain its equity, and to discard me in a low-income facility the moment the money hit their accounts. They were not just parasitic, they were actively malicious. I slowly backed away from the staircase, retreating into the deepest shadows of the hallway. I did not burst into the kitchen to demand answers. I did not scream or throw punches. Confronting them now would only give them the opportunity to destroy the remaining evidence and accelerate their timeline. They thought they had outsmarted a clueless old man. They thought my age made me an easy target. But they had profoundly underestimated the cold, calculated patience of a structural engineer. I quietly returned to my bedroom, shut the door without making a single sound, and sat on the edge of my mattress until the sun came up. I was no longer a grieving widower trying to maintain family peace. I was a man preparing for absolute war. I realized with a chilling, absolute certainty that I was sleeping in a house that might no longer legally belong to me. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. I still had 5 days before their loan cleared, and 5 days was more than enough time to completely dismantle their lives. The sun rose over Austin, casting a deceptive golden warmth through the kitchen windows. I went through my morning routine with mechanical precision. I ground the coffee beans. I listened to the familiar hiss of the percolator. I buttered my toast. A smart man does not burst into a room throwing accusations. A smart man does not strike until his weapon is fully loaded and his aim is absolutely flawless. When Derek and Melanie finally stumbled downstairs, I greeted them with a warm, genuine-sounding good morning. Derek was already dressed in his designer workout gear, looking at his phone with that arrogant, distracted expression he always wore. Melanie poured herself a cup of coffee, avoiding my eyes just as she had the night before. I watched them move around the kitchen, feeling a strange, hollow detachment. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and casually announced my plans. I told them that the weather forecast looked perfect and that I had decided to take a spontaneous 3-day fishing trip up to Lake Travis. I said I needed some fresh air, some quiet time on the water, and that I would not be back until late Friday evening. The physical transformation in Derek was immediate and sickening. The tension in his shoulders evaporated. He let out a breath he had clearly been holding, and a broad, utterly genuine smile broke across his face. He actually walked over and patted me on the back. "That sounds like a fantastic idea, Richard," he said, his voice dripping with forced enthusiasm. "You have been cooped up in this house for way too long. Go out there, catch some largemouth bass, and just relax. Do not even think about checking in on us. We will hold the fort down perfectly while you are gone. Enjoy the peace and quiet." Melanie chimed in, echoing his hollow sentiments, telling me to drive safely and to take my time. They were practically pushing me out the door. They needed me gone. They needed the house empty so Derek could finalize whatever fraudulent collateral loan he had orchestrated without the risk of me answering a phone call from a bank underwriter or a county clerk. I walked out to the garage and loaded my vintage fishing gear into the back of my truck. I meticulously packed the heavy tackle box, the graphite rods, and the large cooler, ensuring the performance was flawless. I hugged my daughter. I shook my son-in-law's hand. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. I watched my beautiful custom-built home fade away in the rearview mirror. The house where I had carried Patricia across the threshold. The house where I had measured Melanie's height on the doorframe of the pantry. It was now a crime scene. I drove toward the highway, but I did not turn north toward the tranquil, shimmering waters of Lake Travis. I turned south, merging onto the interstate, pointing the nose of my truck directly toward the towering glass and steel skyscrapers of downtown Austin. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. I navigated the heavy morning traffic with cold, singular focus. I parked in a secured underground garage beneath a massive commercial tower. I rode the polished brass elevator up to the 32nd floor, stepping out into the sleek, intimidating reception area of one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in the state of Texas. I did not have an appointment, but I did not need one. The receptionist, recognizing me, immediately ushered me directly into the corner office of Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not a family lawyer. Jonathan was a ruthless, high-priced corporate shark. He specialized in aggressive acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and burying corporate fraudsters under mountains of impenetrable legal litigation. We had worked together for over 20 years during my time in commercial construction. He was brilliant, entirely devoid of mercy, and fiercely loyal to his clients. He stood up from behind his massive mahogany desk, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, a look of mild surprise on his sharp, angular face. "Richard," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "what brings you to my office on a Thursday morning? You are supposed to be enjoying your retirement, not visiting a den of vipers." I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk. "I am not retired today, Jonathan. I need your help, and I need it right now." Jonathan sat back down, his professional demeanor instantly engaging. He picked up a silver pen and opened a fresh legal pad. "Tell me exactly what is going on." I laid out the entire situation with absolute mechanical precision. I told him about the $85,000 in hidden credit card debt. I told him about the hushed conversation at 2 a.m. I recounted every single word Derek had spoken about the hospital proxy forms, the collateral loan, and his plan to place me in a cheap nursing home. I gave him the raw, unfiltered facts exactly as an engineer presents a structural failure report. Jonathan stopped writing. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. He placed his pen down on the desk. "Your son-in-law is attempting to execute a fraudulent property transfer," he stated, his voice stripped of all warmth. "If he slipped a transfer deed into a stack of medical proxy forms while you were heavily medicated, that is textbook elder financial exploitation and severe real estate fraud. I need to know exactly how far he has gotten," I said, leaning forward. "I need to know the exact status of my property. I want you to pull every financial document, every real estate record, and every single corporate filing attached to my name, my personal social security number, and my home address." Jonathan nodded sharply. He turned to his dual monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced, terrifying speed. He bypassed standard portals, logging into secure county databases. The silence in the office was heavy, broken only by the rapid clicking of his keyboard. I sat perfectly still, listening to the muffled sounds of the downtown traffic far below us. I watched the data scrolling across his glasses. After several agonizing minutes, Jonathan clicked a final button. Across the room, a large commercial laser printer hummed to life. It began churning out page after page of dense legal documentation. The machine spit out dozens of warm sheets into the receiving tray. Jonathan stood up, walked over to the printer, and collected the massive stack of paper. He returned to his mahogany desk and sat down heavily. He placed the stack right in front of him. He stared at the top printed sheet for a very long time, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. The professional detachment vanished from his expression, replaced by a profound, disturbing shock. He slowly reached up and took off his glasses. He looked across the desk, meeting my eyes with a grim, solemn expression. "Richard," he softly said, his voice dropping to a low, heavy whisper. "You simply do not own your house anymore." I stared at Jonathan, letting the weight of his words settle into the sterile air. I did not speak immediately. I reached across the desk and took the top sheet of paper. The document was crisp, bearing the official seal of the Travis County clerk. Printed in bold letters were the words, "Quitclaim Deed." I read the legal jargon, slowly processing each constructed sentence. The document stated that I willingly surrendered all rights, titles, and interests in the property I built with my own 2 hands. It relinquished my ownership of the land foundation and roof. I had donated my $2.5 million estate entirely free of charge to a corporate entity known as Apex Holdings, LLC. My eyes drifted to the final page. Sitting against the white paper was my own signature. It was not a clever forgery. It was not a digital copy. It was my genuine, authentic handwriting. Next to my name was the stamp of a public notary, complete with a date and time of execution. The memory of that date hit me like a wrecking ball. It was exactly 3 months ago. I was lying in my bed fighting a severe bout of pneumonia that had left me dangerously weak. I was heavily medicated on prescription painkillers, my mind clouded by a relentless fever. I remembered Derek walking into my bedroom. He was wearing his tailored suit, acting the part of the deeply concerned son-in-law. He handed me a thick stack of medical proxy forms. He told me the hospital required immediate updates to my files in case my condition worsened overnight. He handed me a silver pen. He pointed to the dotted lines, reassuring me that he had already reviewed everything. I had trusted him completely. I signed my name wherever his manicured finger pointed. I sat back, the document trembling slightly in my grasp. The physical pain in my chest was blinding. Derek had not just stolen my wealth. He had weaponized my illness. He used my physical vulnerability and my absolute trust in my family to steal the very roof over my head. He had stolen the house where I had carried Patricia across the threshold. He erased 40 years of my blood, sweat, and sacrifice with a few drops of ink. But the theft of the property was not the wound that made it difficult to breathe. The true agony was the absolute certainty of my daughter's complicity. Melanie knew. She had stood in my kitchen at 2 a.m, weeping not out of guilt, but out of selfish terror that their theft might be uncovered. She had known for months that her husband had stolen my life savings. She knew he planned to secure a collateral loan against the equity of my home to pay off his gambling debts. She knew he intended to discard me in a low-income nursing facility. The little girl I had raised had actively participated in my financial execution, just to preserve her comfortable lifestyle. I closed my eyes, allowing the grief to wash over me. I allowed myself to feel the profound, shattering loss of the family I thought I had. And then, just as quickly as it had arrived, I forced the grief away. I locked it in a dark vault in the back of my mind. Grief is an entirely useless emotion when you are standing on a battlefield. I opened my eyes. The devastated father was gone. Only the engineer remained, and I needed to understand the mechanics of the trap I was caught in. Who owns Apex Holdings, LLC? I asked, my voice stripped of emotion. Where is this company registered and who are the managing partners? Jonathan leaned forward, his professional instincts matching my shift in tone. That is the next phase of the investigation. If your son-in-law transferred your primary asset to a corporate entity, he had to file the articles of incorporation. We need to look at the foundational documents of Apex Holdings to see exactly how he structured the theft. He turned to his monitors, fingers flying across the keyboard. He pulled up the secure database for corporate registrations. The screen reflected in his glasses as he navigated through the dense public records. He was searching for the exact moment Derek had created the corporate shield designed to hide my stolen wealth. "This is highly sophisticated," Jonathan murmured, reading the data cascading across his screen. "Your son-in-law did not use a generic online legal service. He routed the incorporation documents through a registered agent in Delaware to mask the initial ownership hierarchy. He designed this company to be a black box. He wanted to make it incredibly difficult and expensive for anyone to trace the true beneficiaries. It is an aggressive asset protection strategy." I stared at the wood grain of the mahogany desk, calculating the variables. Derek was arrogant, but he was not a mastermind. He was a mid-level financial employee drowning in credit card debt and gambling liabilities. He lacked the capital to hire offshore lawyers. He must have cut corners. He must have taken a massive risk to set up the corporate shell without alerting the IRS or triggering a deep background check by the state regulators. Arrogant, desperate men always take shortcuts. They believe they are the smartest people in the room, and that fundamental belief makes them incredibly sloppy. "Jonathan," I said quietly, "look at the tax identification numbers. Look at the primary principal registry. He did not have the cash to do this legitimately. He must have left a footprint." Jonathan fell silent. The rapid clicking of his keyboard stopped. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes darting back and forth across a specific section of the digital filing. The grim professional tension in his face suddenly morphed into something else entirely. It was a look of pure, bewildered astonishment. He took a sharp breath, slowly shaking his head in disbelief. "Richard," Jonathan said, his voice carrying a strange, dangerous mixture of shock and predatory amusement. "You are absolutely right." He was desperate, and his arrogance just caused him to make a catastrophic error. "What did he do?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly measured. Jonathan turned the monitor so I could see the official state registry for Apex Holdings LLC. He pointed a steady finger at the illuminated screen. To set up a corporate entity capable of holding a $2.5 million real estate asset without raising massive red flags regarding his own terrible credit history, your son-in-law needed a pristine financial guarantor. He needed a founder with impeccable credit, no debts, and a flawless tax record. He paused, letting the silence build in the room. He looked at me, a sharp, vindictive smile forming on his lips. "He did not just steal your house, Richard. He used your pristine financial history to build the company he stole it with. He filed the foundational documents using your exact identity, including your full name and social security number. He handed you absolute legal control of this corporation. It is a flaw so massive it is going to completely destroy him." I leaned forward in my leather chair, staring at the digital reflection, dancing across Jonathan's lenses. I needed him to break down the legal architecture of this fraud into terms I could dismantle. I asked him to explain exactly how a man who was $85,000 in debt could successfully register a corporate entity without sounding every single financial alarm in the state of Texas. Jonathan folded his hands on top of his mahogany desk, his voice dropping into the precise clinical cadence he reserved for courtroom dismantling. He explained that setting up a shell company designed to absorb a $2.5 million real estate asset requires a pristine financial background. If Derek used his own name, the Internal Revenue Service and state banking regulators would have immediately flagged the transaction. A man with subprime credit and massive unsecured debt cannot simply create a holding company and transfer a luxury estate into it without triggering an exhaustive audit. The banks would have demanded income verification and a spotless credit history before ever approving the collateral loan he was planning to extract. Derek knew his financial footprint was a toxic wasteland, Jonathan said. So he built the company using your foundation. He took your social security number and impeccable credit history to register Apex Holdings. He named you as the sole managing member and the exclusive principal owner. He forged your signature on the Articles of Incorporation. He literally created a company that belongs entirely to you. I sat back, letting the audacious stupidity of his plan wash over me. But how does he plan to get the money, I asked. If the company is in my name, how does he access the collateral loan? Jonathan pulled up another screen. That is where his background as a financial employee comes in. When he set up the bank accounts for Apex Holdings, he designated himself as the primary account manager with full back-end administrative access. It is a corporate loophole. The owner holds the equity, but the manager holds the routing numbers. His plan is entirely rooted in his belief that you are technologically illiterate. He assumes you will never know this holding company exists. Once the bank approves the loan, the funds will be deposited directly into the Apex Holdings business account. Derek will then use his back-end access to wire the money to his creditors before you ever notice a missing piece of mail. I listened to the quiet mechanics of a trap that had been designed to bury me. Derek thought I was a clueless boomer. He thought I was an obsolete relic who only understood hammers and concrete, completely incapable of navigating the digital landscape of corporate finance. He believed that because he wore a tailored suit and used sophisticated jargon, he was inherently superior. He constructed his entire fraudulent empire on the assumption of my absolute ignorance. But a house built on arrogance is a house built on sand. Jonathan slid the printed corporate registry across the desk. Legally speaking, Richard, your son-in-law, has done absolutely nothing to strip you of your wealth. On a federal level, Apex Holdings LLC belongs 100% to you. The bank account belongs to you. Every asset held by the corporation belongs to you. Derek effectively transferred the deed of your home from Richard the individual to Richard the corporation. He did all the heavy lifting, absorbed the legal risks of forgery, and handed you the keys. He is nothing more than an unauthorized employee operating inside your company. The realization hit me with the force of a thunderclap. Derek had not stolen my home. He had accidentally barricaded it behind a corporate fortress that I now commanded. He was sweating over collateral loan applications and juggling debt, completely unaware that he was shoveling money into a vault only I owned. A cold satisfaction began to spread through my chest, replacing the suffocating pain of my daughter's betrayal. Melanie had chosen her arrogant, thieving husband over the father who had protected her. They had both looked at me and seen a victim. They saw a weak widower who would quietly accept a bed in a cheap nursing facility while they celebrated their millions. Jonathan reached for the telephone sitting on the corner of his desk. His hand hovered over the receiver, his eyes locked onto mine with a predatory gleam. Richard, Jonathan said, his voice tight with anticipation. We have everything we need right here. I have the forged incorporation documents, the quitclaim deed, and the digital footprint of his unauthorized banking access. I can call the district attorney right now. I can have a team of detectives waiting at his financial firm before he even returns from lunch. We can have him arrested for identity theft, wire fraud, and elder financial abuse today. He will be wearing handcuffs by 3 o'clock. I looked at the telephone. I pictured Derek sitting in his office feeling the smug satisfaction of a man who believes he pulled off the perfect crime. I pictured Melanie waiting for the bank transfer to clear so they could dispose of me. If I authorized that call, the police would arrest Derek. He would hire a sleazy attorney. He would claim it was a family dispute blown out of proportion. He would drag Melanie into the courtroom to cry and play the victim, securing a sympathetic plea deal. He would get a slap on the wrist, a suspended sentence, and a minor mark on his record. He would survive. I reached across the desk and placed my hand over the receiver, stopping him. No, I said, my voice resonating with a terrifying, absolute calm. We are not calling. Not yet. Jonathan frowned, his hand freezing over the phone. Richard. The man is attempting to secure a loan against your property. If we let this proceed, the legal untangling will be a nightmare. Why would you wait? I looked at the documents spread across the desk, mapping the structural weaknesses of his life. Because if I arrest him now, he gets a slap on the wrist, I explained. He plays the victim. He walks away believing he was just unlucky. That is not how you handle a structural failure. When a beam is rotten, you do not paint over it. You load the roof with weight until the rot completely snaps and the whole thing comes crashing down on the architect. I pulled my hand back from the phone and looked Jonathan straight in the eyes. I do not want him to fail, Jonathan. I want him to execute the loan. I want him to sign the final paperwork. I want him to watch the millions hit the Apex Holdings bank account. I want him to feel the absolute intoxicating high of victory. I want him to believe that he has completely defeated me. And then, at the exact moment he reaches out to take the money, I am going to lock him out of the accounts. I will pull the floor out from under his feet. I will let him default on his predatory lenders. I want him to lose everything. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face as he absorbed the sheer ruthlessness of my instruction. He did not try to talk me down. He did not offer any soft, mitigating alternatives. He recognized that we were no longer practicing preventative law. We were constructing a financial guillotine. For the remainder of that Thursday, I did not leave his corner office. We ordered black coffee and locked the heavy oak doors, transforming the room into a war room. The counterattack required absolute precision. Because Derek had used my exact social security number, my legal name, and my pristine credit history to forge the foundational documents of Apex Holdings. I possessed the ultimate, undisputed authority over the entire corporate entity. He had built the castle, but I held the master key to every single gate. Jonathan summoned 2 of his senior paralegals and a forensic digital specialist to assist in the operation. We began drafting a mountain of legally binding affidavits. I signed my name dozens of times, pressing the ink into the heavy paper with a fierce, unwavering determination. Each signature was properly notarized, certified, and officially logged into the firm's private registry. We systematically contacted the central banking institutions where Derek had established the corporate accounts. We did not freeze the accounts, as that would immediately notify the account manager. Instead, using my verified identity and the newly minted legal affidavits, we quietly established a supreme master level of administrative control. We effectively placed an invisible, impenetrable layer of authority directly above Derek's access tier. We rerouted the ultimate corporate authority directly to me. I was now recognized by the banking infrastructure as the sole executive capable of authorizing outbound wire transfers of a certain magnitude. The forensic digital specialist, a quiet young man with sharp eyes, meticulously mapped out Derek's existing digital footprint. He explained that Derek had set up automated security alerts linked to his personal mobile phone and his private email address. If we changed the passwords right then, or if we explicitly revoked his user credentials, the banking system would immediately send an automated warning directly to Derek's device. It would trigger an alarm, and he would know instantly that his digital fortress had been breached. We could not allow that to happen. He needed to feel completely secure. He needed to believe that his sophisticated plan was moving forward without a single hitch. So we executed the most critical phase of the setup. We intentionally left his passwords exactly as they were. We left his email linked to the primary view settings. We ensured that he would not receive a single security alert. When he logged into the corporate portal from his leased Porsche or from my living room sofa, the screens would look completely normal. He would see the holding company. He would see the loan application status. He would see the empty accounts waiting for the massive influx of cash. He thinks he still controls the company, Jonathan explained, tapping his silver pen against the desk. He can log in, he can browse the interfaces, and he can even finalize the inbound collateral loan. The lenders will deposit the $2.5 million into the Apex Holdings account just as he planned. But the moment he attempts to move that money out of the corporate account, to pay off his personal creditors, the system will hit a hard, invisible wall. Our master protocol will trigger instantly. It will automatically lock the funds, freeze the entire account structure, and permanently sever his user access. He will be locked outside in the cold, staring through a digital window at a mountain of cash he can never touch. It was a flawless, merciless trap. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the entire legal and digital architecture was fully operational. I shook Jonathan's hand, thanking him for his aggressive efficiency. I walked out of the corporate tower and rode the elevator down to the underground parking garage. My mind was crystal clear. The panic and grief that had suffocated me the night before were completely gone, replaced by a cold, stabilizing focus. But I still had a role to play. I could not simply drive home in my crisp, button-down shirt and act like a man who had just dismantled a financial conspiracy. I was supposed to be on a 3-day fishing trip at Lake Travis. I had to make the illusion absolutely perfect. Arrogant men only look for the obvious lies. If the surface details match their expectations, they never dig deeper. I drove my truck to a rustic open-air fish market situated on the rural outskirts of the city. I purchased 2 large, freshly caught largemouth bass, handing the vendor a wad of cash to keep the transaction off any digital records. I placed the fish in my heavy cooler, burying them in a thick layer of crushed ice. Before getting back into the driver's seat, I grabbed a handful of dry, dusty earth from the edge of the parking lot and rubbed it vigorously into the knees of my denim jeans. I splashed a small amount of stagnant water from a nearby puddle onto my boots, making them look worn and appropriately weathered. I took off my watch and ruffled my hair. I looked exactly like a tired, aging man who had spent the last 3 days fighting the Texas sun on the deck of a small aluminum boat. I timed my return perfectly. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the manicured lawns of my suburban neighborhood as I pulled into my driveway. The house looked peaceful from the outside, a picture of domestic tranquility. I parked the truck, grabbed the heavy cooler by the handles, and carried it up the front walkway. I pushed open the heavy oak door and walked into the foyer. The smell of roasted garlic and expensive wine drifted from the kitchen. I could hear the faint pulsing bass of music playing from the ceiling speakers. I hauled the cooler into the kitchen, letting it drop onto the tile floor with a loud, wet thud. Melanie and Derek were standing by the granite island. Derek was holding a crystal wine glass, dressed in crisp linen trousers and a casual button-down shirt. He looked incredibly relaxed, the picture of a man who did not have a single care in the world. Melanie was chopping vegetables, her face bright and unburdened. They had clearly spent the last 3 days celebrating their impending victory. Derek turned around, his eyes widening in a display of practiced mock surprise. "Richard," he exclaimed, stepping forward with a wide, welcoming smile. "You are back early. We did not expect you until much later tonight. How was the lake? Did the fish cooperate with you?" I let out a long, heavy sigh, rolling my shoulders, as if they ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I offered him a weary, authentic-looking smile. The lake was beautiful, Derek. The sun was a little brutal for an old man like me, but it was incredibly peaceful. I just needed some quiet time to clear my head. I caught a few decent ones, but I decided to pack it in a little early. The old joints just do not recover the way they used to. I popped the latch on the cooler and kicked the lid open with the toe of my muddy boot. I gestured down at the 2 large bass resting on the bed of crushed ice. "I brought dinner," I said cheerfully. Derek peered into the cooler and let out an impressed whistle. "Those are fantastic, Richard. Really great work. You go get cleaned up and rest those joints. You look completely exhausted. I will take care of cleaning these up for you. Just relax. You have absolutely nothing to worry about here." He was so incredibly smug. He looked at me and saw nothing but a frail, obsolete fool who had kindly vacated the premises so he could finalize his grand theft. He felt completely in control of the universe. "Thank you, Derek," I said softly, my voice dripping with manufactured gratitude. "I think I will just head upstairs and get some sleep. I appreciate you taking care of things for me." I turned and walked slowly toward the staircase, maintaining my slow, shuffling gait until I was completely out of their line of sight. As I reached the upper landing, the facade dropped entirely. I stood in the dark hallway listening to the faint sound of their laughter, drifting up from the kitchen below. My breathing was slow and steady. My hands were perfectly calm. The trap was fully armed. The digital snare was perfectly concealed beneath the floorboards of his own arrogance. I did not need to confront him. I did not need to shout or demand answers. I just needed to wait for him to step on the wire. The next morning dawned with a heavy and suffocating atmosphere pressing down on the entire house. The air felt thick and humid perfectly, reflecting the unspoken hostility that simmered just beneath the surface of our forced family interactions. I walked into the kitchen at 7 o'clock to find Derek and Melanie sitting at the granite island. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones, their heads bowed close together. The moment my footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor, they snapped apart. Melanie quickly busied herself with pouring a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly, while Derek aggressively swiped at the screen of his mobile phone. I offered them a pleasant and entirely hollow good morning. I poured my own coffee and sat at the small breakfast table, deliberately projecting the image of a tired, oblivious old man recovering from a long trip. The tension in the room was absolute. They were watching me like prey, waiting for me to retreat, so they could resume their frantic plotting. I played my part flawlessly. I drank my coffee, complained mildly about an imaginary ache in my lower back, and told them I planned to spend the entire day resting in the sunroom. Derek offered a tight, forced smile and told me that resting was an excellent idea. He grabbed his briefcase and announced he was heading into the office early to handle some critical investment portfolios. Melanie gave him a brief, nervous kiss on the cheek before he hurried out the front door. The moment the heavy engine of his leased vehicle faded down the suburban street, I stood up and moved to the front window. I watched the quiet neighborhood, calculating the exact time the postal carrier usually arrived. Derek thought his morning mail interception routine was perfectly secure. He believed his heavy brass padlock was an impenetrable barrier. But a man who spent 40 years constructing commercial buildings knows that every single lock has a bypass and every routine has a blind spot. I did not need to break the brass padlock on the mailbox. I simply needed to reach the postal worker before the mail was ever deposited into the metal box. I stepped out the front door and began walking down the sidewalk, enjoying the warm morning breeze. I walked 3 blocks down the street, positioning myself right at the corner where the familiar white mail truck always made its turn into our subdivision. I waited patiently under the shade of a large oak tree. Within 15 minutes, the truck pulled up to the curb. I greeted the carrier by his first name. We had exchanged pleasantries for over a decade. I smiled warmly and told him that I was expecting a very important package of fishing lures and asked if I could just grab my household mail directly from him to save him the stop. He smiled back, happy to oblige a friendly neighbor, and handed me a thick stack of envelopes bound with a rubber band. I thanked him, turned around, and walked slowly back to my house. I bypassed the locked mailbox entirely. I walked through the front door, locked the deadbolt behind me, and carried the stack of mail into my private study. I sat down at my heavy wooden desk and spread the envelopes out across the polished surface. Most of them were standard utility bills, colorful advertisements, and glossy catalogs addressed to Melanie. But near the bottom of the stack, I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a thick, heavy envelope made of premium textured paper. The return address printed in the top left corner belonged to a notorious predatory private lending firm based out of Chicago. This was not a standard bank. This was a firm known in financial circles for issuing high-risk, rapid cash loans with astronomical interest rates and absolutely brutal collateral seizure terms. The envelope was addressed to Apex Holdings, LLC. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a silver letter opener. I slid the blade under the flap, slicing it open with a clean, sharp motion. I pulled out a stack of dense legal documents. I unfolded the papers and smoothed them out flat on the desktop. My eyes scanned the bold black text, taking in the full scope of Derek's desperation. It was a final approval notice for a massive commercial cash out loan. Derek had leveraged the entire appraised value of my property to secure a hard money loan of exactly $1 million. The documents detailed the payment schedule and the collateral terms. If the loan defaulted, the Chicago lending firm would immediately seize the property. But it was the attached statement of designated funds that revealed the true sickening depth of his depravity. The loan was not meant for investments. It was not meant for a high-yield tech fund or corporate expansion. The document listed a series of direct wire transfers scheduled to occur the moment the loan cleared. Half of the money was designated to pay off a sprawling network of offshore gambling syndicates. Derek had accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit sports betting debts. The rest of the money was earmarked for high-risk offshore trading accounts. He was drowning in an underground ocean of gambling liabilities, and he was using the very foundation of my home as his personal life raft. I stared at the paperwork, a cold and terrifying clarity washing over me. The closing date for the $1 million loan was printed clearly at the bottom of the final page. It was exactly 5 days away. In exactly 120 hours, the Chicago lending firm would deposit $1 million into the Apex Holdings bank account. Derek would immediately wire the money to his violent underground creditors to save his own skin. And because the loan was secured against my property, I would be left completely responsible for the debt. If he succeeded, he would walk away free and clear, leaving me absolutely homeless, stripped of my life savings, and buried under a mountain of predatory debt that I could never possibly repay. He would destroy my entire existence to cover a few bad bets. I did not panic. Panic is an emotion reserved for men who do not have a plan. I simply picked up the telephone from my desk and dialed the direct private number for Jonathan Pierce. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and professional. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what I held in my hands. I detailed the $1 million cash-out loan, the predatory Chicago lending firm, the gambling syndicates, and the 5-day closing deadline. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the information with the precise, detached tone of a man reporting a structural failure. Jonathan listened silently until I finished. I could hear the faint scratch of his pen on a legal pad. "This is incredibly reckless," Richard Jonathan finally said, his voice laced with a cold, predatory amusement. "Your son-in-law is not just committing fraud anymore. He is intentionally defrauding a major private lending institution across state lines. This elevates his actions from a local real estate dispute to a severe federal crime. He has completely sealed his own fate." "What is our next move?" I asked, staring at the printed closing date. "I need to make absolutely sure that he cannot execute the final stage of this theft." Jonathan instructed me to stay exactly where I was. He explained that we needed to sever the final chord of Derek's plan without triggering any alarms on his end. "I want you to authorize me to contact the county clerk immediately," Jonathan said. "We are going to file a silent administrative hold on the property deed. We will place a quiet encumbrance on the title, completely freezing any transfer of equity or collateral assignment at the county level. We will flag the entire estate for an active high-level fraud investigation. It is a completely invisible legal barricade." I gave him the explicit authorization to proceed. Jonathan promised that within the hour, the property title would be locked down tighter than a federal vault. The brilliant part of this strategy was its absolute silence. Derek would not receive a single notification from the county. The predatory lending firm in Chicago would not see the fraud flag until the very last second when they attempted to finalize the legal underwriting on the morning of the closing date. They would run the final title check, see the massive administrative hold, and the entire $1 million loan would instantly collapse. Derek was going to walk into that closing meeting believing he was a mastermind. He would believe he was moments away from clearing his massive gambling debts and securing his financial freedom. He would reach out to take the money, and he would grasp absolutely nothing but empty air. His violent creditors would come calling, his financial firm would discover the federal fraud, and he would have nowhere left to hide. The trap was set, the title was frozen. and his loan was destined to fail in a catastrophic, highly public explosion. But as I neatly folded the loan documents and placed them in my safe, a profound sense of satisfaction washed over me. He did not know it yet. He was already a dead man walking. I just had to wait 5 more days to watch him fall. The wait was a masterclass in psychological endurance. I spent Monday maintaining the absolute illusion of compliance, carefully playing the role of the exhausted father, while a silent, invisible guillotine hung directly over my son-in-law's head. By the time Tuesday evening rolled around, the atmosphere inside my home had shifted from tense anxiety to an intoxicating manic euphoria. Derek was practically vibrating with a toxic, unearned confidence. He truly believed he had outsmarted the world. He believed the $1 million cash-out loan was an absolute certainty, a done deal just waiting for Friday morning to finalize. His underground gambling debts, which had undoubtedly been threatening to swallow him whole, were about to be washed clean by the equity of my stolen house. He strutted through the living room with the swagger of a conqueror, pouring himself expensive scotch and speaking in loud, boastful tones about his brilliant financial acumen. Melanie seemed to feed off his manic energy, her previous tearful panic entirely replaced by a smug, contented relief. They were celebrating their impending wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that their financial foundation had already been entirely vaporized by Jonathan Pierce and a quiet county clerk. It was just after 7 o'clock when the local news broadcast announced that the state Mega Millions jackpot had officially rolled over to a staggering $95 million. Derek, sitting on the leather sofa with his feet propped up on the coffee table, let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He pointed his crystal glass at the television screen, declaring that a man with his level of momentum was destined to win that jackpot. He announced to Melanie that he was making a quick run to the corner gas station to buy a stack of tickets. He said it was a foolproof investment strategy, a fitting cherry on top of what was shaping up to be the most lucrative week of his entire life. I sat in my reading chair holding a hardcover book I was not actually reading, and simply nodded as he grabbed his keys and strutted out the front door. I waited exactly 2 minutes before standing up and walking into the kitchen. The large bay window above the sink offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the driveway and the quiet suburban street beyond. The sky was fading into a deep, bruised twilight, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. I stood in the darkened kitchen, completely still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, arrogant roar of Derek's leased Porsche Macan echoing down the block. He was driving entirely too fast for a residential neighborhood, clearly high on the adrenaline of his own perceived brilliance. I watched the blinding glare of his headlights sweep across the front of my house as he aggressively pulled into the driveway, slamming the brakes at the very last possible second. He stepped out of this vehicle, slamming the heavy door shut with an obnoxious thud. He did not walk up the driveway. He practically marched, his chest puffed out, holding a thick, colorful fan of lottery tickets in his right hand. He was flicking them against his palm, grinning from ear to ear. But my eyes did not stay fixed on the lottery tickets. My focus, sharpened by decades of catching minute structural flaws on chaotic construction sites, immediately locked onto his left hand. Derek was holding his expensive leather wallet. He was in the process of sliding a credit card back into one of the front slots. It was not his personal bank card. It was not a standard platinum rewards card. It was a heavy matte black metal card with a very distinct silver logo embossed in the top right corner. The ambient light from the front porch fixture caught the metallic edge of the card for just a fraction of a second, but a fraction of a second was all I needed. I recognized that specific card immediately. I had seen an identical design just 24 hours ago while sitting in Jonathan Pierce's downtown law office reviewing the comprehensive financial dossier of the corporation Derek had fraudulently established. It was the primary corporate expense card directly linked to the operational bank accounts of Apex Holdings, LLC. I remained perfectly motionless in the shadows of the kitchen, tracking his movements as he approached the front porch. My mind raced, processing the massive, catastrophic magnitude of what I had just witnessed. Derek was a man completely drowning in personal illicit debt. His personal bank accounts were undoubtedly drained, his credit completely frozen by collection agencies. He had absolutely zero liquid cash to his name, so when he decided to indulge his arrogant whim and purchase a stack of Mega Millions tickets, he did not use his own money. He had pulled out the corporate expense card. He had used the financial assets of Apex Holdings LLC to fund his personal gambling habit at a corner gas station. He had just handed me the key to his absolute destruction. By using that specific black card, he had crossed a legal threshold from which there was absolutely no return. Legally speaking, on a state and federal level, Apex Holdings LLC did not belong to him. Thanks to his own desperate arrogance and his forged incorporation documents, the company belonged 100% to me. I was the sole proprietor. I was the exclusive managing director. He was nothing more than an unauthorized individual who had somehow gained access to the corporate routing numbers. By swiping that card at the gas station register, he had not just bought lottery tickets. He had committed textbook corporate embezzlement. He had executed wire fraud. He had documented the theft of corporate funds from a company that I legally controlled, leaving a perfect, indisputable paper trail in the state lottery system. The front door clicked open, and Derek walked into the foyer, whistling a tuneless, upbeat melody. He tossed his keys onto the console table and walked into the kitchen, freezing for a brief second when he saw me standing by the window in the dark. He quickly recovered, flashing that same hollow, condescending smile, completely unaware that he had just stepped onto an active landmine. He held up the freshly printed lottery tickets like a glittering golden trophy, telling me that our luck was about to change permanently. I smiled warmly back at him, looking directly into his cold, calculating eyes, and told him that I absolutely agreed. The ultimate weapon had just been handed directly to me. He had forged my signature to steal my house, and in a stroke of pure, unadulterated hubris, he had just used my own corporation to pay for his absurd lottery fantasies. Tomorrow morning, I would immediately call the fraud division of the State Lottery Commission and explicitly report a severe documented misuse of our corporate assets. I would let the ruthless federal authorities build a criminal indictment so flawlessly airtight that no expensive defense attorney could ever pull him out of the impending wreckage. The long, agonizing wait was completely and entirely finished. The game was truly over, and I had won. Wednesday dragged by with a heavy slowness. I spent the daylight hours in my private study finalizing the digital safeguards with Jonathan Pierce over a secure phone line, ensuring the corporate barricades around Apex Holdings were impenetrable. By the time evening rolled in, the atmosphere inside the house had grown thick with a different kind of tension. Derek was pacing the downstairs hallway, checking his watch every 5 minutes. He was suspended between the crippling anxiety of his impending $1 million collateral loan closure and the sheer fantasy of the state lottery draw. I remained in the kitchen, deliberately occupying myself with the mundane task of polishing the stainless steel appliances. I wanted to be close enough to observe the impending spectacle without appearing overly invested. The local news broadcast was playing on the large flat-screen television in the adjacent living room, the volume turned up entirely too high. The evening anchors were bantering back and forth about the unprecedented $95 million jackpot building, the manufactured suspense that keeps millions of desperate people glued to their screens. Derek was sitting on the edge of the leather sectional sofa, his posture rigidly straight. He held a cold bottle of imported beer in his left hand and the fan of lottery tickets in his right. Melanie was sitting at the opposite end of the couch, mindlessly scrolling through a catalog on her tablet, completely detached from the reality of their impending financial ruin. She occasionally glanced up to offer a hollow word of encouragement, humoring her husband's desperate delusions. I watched them from the kitchen threshold, leaning casually against the doorframe, with a damp cloth in my hand. I studied Derek closely as the broadcast shifted to the live lottery drawing. The brightly lit studio, the tumbling plastic balls, the overly enthusiastic announcer filling the room with noise. Derek leaned forward, the glow of the television screen illuminating the sweat forming on his forehead. He placed his beer bottle precariously near the edge of the glass coffee table and began flipping through his tickets, aligning his intense gaze with the numbers appearing on the broadcast. The first number was drawn. A match. Derek let out a sharp, breathless chuckle, muttering under his breath about the law of averages. The second plastic ball dropped heavily into the chute. Another match. I watched the muscles in Derek's jaw tighten, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the small slip of paper. The third ball rolled into place, then the fourth, and finally the fifth. With every single corresponding number, the air in the living room seemed to grow denser, heavier, until it felt exactly like the atmospheric pressure right before a massive structural collapse. The television announcer paused for dramatic effect before revealing the final mega ball. Derek was absolutely frozen. He was holding the winning ticket mere inches from his face, his eyes darting frantically between the printed numbers and the television screen. When the final golden ball dropped and the announcer shouted the winning number, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. Derek stopped breathing. His chest froze mid-inhalation. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. His left hand twitched violently with a sudden, uncontrollable spasm. His fingers bumped the glass beer bottle. It tipped over the edge and plummeted toward the floor. The glass shattered violently against the polished oak hardwood, sending a spray of amber liquid and sharp shrapnel across the expensive Persian rug. The explosive sound of the shattering glass broke the heavy spell. Derek let out a sound that was not entirely human. It was a guttural, primal scream of absolute disbelief and overwhelming triumph. He threw the remaining useless lottery tickets into the air, creating a shower of colorful paper that rained down around him. He lunged across the leather sofa and tackled Melanie, practically crushing her against the armrest. "We won!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a hysterical, manic pitch. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "Melanie, look at this. Look at the screen right now. We hold the single winning ticket. We won $95 million. We are multi-millionaires." Melanie dropped her tablet, her eyes going wide with absolute shock. She stared at the ticket in his trembling hand, then looked back at the television screen before letting out a piercing shriek of pure, unfiltered joy. The house erupted into chaotic euphoria. They were jumping up and down, hugging each other tightly, crying tears of relief and shouting wildly about purchasing massive mansions, chartering private jets, and living a life completely devoid of financial consequences. I did not react to the noise. I did not flinch at the shouting. I slowly folded the damp cloth, placed it neatly on the kitchen counter, and wiped my hands. I stepped out of the shadows of the kitchen and walked slowly into the brightly lit living room. I kept my hands casually tucked into the pockets of my trousers, projecting the image of a calm, slightly confused old man who had just been startled by a sudden commotion. I stepped deliberately over the shattered remains of the beer bottle, the loud crunch of the broken glass beneath my boots, drawing their immediate attention. Derek spun around, his chest heaving heavily, his face flushed bright red with the adrenaline of a $95 million victory. The exact moment his eyes locked onto mine, the chaotic joy instantly evaporated from his expression. The triumphant, celebratory smile twisted and warped, dangerously hardening into a dark mask of pure, unadulterated malice. I could practically see the gears turning behind his eyes. The desperate need for the fraudulent collateral loan was completely gone. The terrifying fear of his violent underground creditors was instantly erased from his mind. He no longer needed to sneak around my house in the dark or pretend to respect the man who had sheltered him. He held a piece of paper that granted him absolute power to rewrite his reality, and in his arrogant mind, that reality no longer included me. The carefully constructed facade of the struggling son-in-law shattered completely, leaving nothing but a ruthless, entitled predator staring back at me. He stood up straight, squaring his broad shoulders, clutching the $95 million ticket tightly in his right fist. He looked at me not as a father, not as a gracious benefactor, but as an obsolete obstacle that he was finally equipped to permanently bulldoze out of his way. The silence that fell between us was heavy and toxic, drowning out the cheerful background noise of the lottery broadcast. Derek took a slow, deliberate step over the shattered glass, closing the distance between us. He was savoring the moment, drinking in the intoxicating feeling of absolute superiority. He glanced around the living room, looking at the custom woodwork, the vaulted ceilings and the expensive furniture, as if he were compiling an inventory of items he intended to throw into a dumpster. His posture radiated a sudden aggressive dominance. He truly believed he had purchased the right to be a tyrant for the low cost of a $2 lottery ticket. He looked back at me, his eyes gleaming with a cold, vindictive satisfaction. The entire power dynamic in the room had shifted violently, or at least that is exactly what he assumed. He had absolutely no idea his new weapon was already resting firmly inside my locked, securely sealed and impenetrable corporate vault. Derek stood completely still in the center of the living room, the crushed glass of his dropped beer bottle crunching softly beneath the expensive leather of his Italian loafers. The manic, jubilant energy that had just practically vibrated through the walls of my home had suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It was a cold, sharp, and brutally arrogant posture. The winning Mega Millions ticket was clutched so tightly in his right fist that his knuckles were stark white. He did not look at me with the polite, condescending patience he usually reserved for his supposedly senile father-in-law. He looked at me with the pure, unadulterated contempt of a man who suddenly realized he no longer had to play by the rules of human decency. He believed he held $95 million in the palm of his sweating hand. He believed the brutal, suffocating pressure of his underground gambling debts was entirely gone. He believed he was completely invincible. I remained standing near the threshold, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my worn denim jeans. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, projecting the image of a confused old man struggling to comprehend the sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. Derek took a deep, shuddering breath, expanding his chest as he looked around the vaulted ceilings and custom woodwork of the house I had built with my own two hands. He was looking at the property not as a shared home, but as a minor, insignificant asset he was about to discard. His eyes slowly traveled back to my face, and the mask he had worn for the past 3 years completely disintegrated. There was no more fake warmth. There was no more feigned concern for my health. There was only a ruthless, naked greed. "Pack your bags, old man," Derek said, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding register that echoed off the hardwood floors. I blinked, feigning a slow, confused reaction. "What are you talking about, Derek? Where am I supposed to go?" "Get out of my house tonight," he snapped, taking a threatening step forward and jabbing a finger in my direction. "I am entirely done playing this ridiculous game with you. I am done smiling at your boring stories. I am done pretending to care about your joints or your fishing trips. You are a pathetic, clinging burden, and I do not need to pretend anymore. I have $95 million sitting right here in my hand. I do not need the equity in this miserable house anymore. I do not need to wait for the bank to approve my loans. I am completely free, and the very first thing I am going to do with my freedom is remove you from my sight permanently." The sheer venom in his words was staggering, even though I knew it was coming. He was so incredibly eager to inflict pain, so desperate to exercise his perceived power over the man he thought he had successfully swindled. He pointed a rigid finger toward the front door, his face twisting into an ugly, triumphant sneer. "Go upstairs, put your dusty clothes in a garbage bag, and leave," Derek commanded, his voice rising in volume. "If you are not out of this house in exactly 1 hour, I will personally throw you out onto the front lawn." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to his pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. Instead, I slowly turned my gaze away from his flushed, angry face and looked directly at my daughter. Melanie was standing near the leather sectional sofa, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. The sweet, innocent girl I had carried on my shoulders and protected from the world was completely gone. In her place stood a cold, calculating stranger who was absolutely intoxicated by the delusion of immense wealth. Melanie, I said softly, allowing a perfectly measured amount of paternal disappointment to bleed into my tone. Are you really going to stand there and let him throw your father out on the street? Are you going to let him banish me into the dark after everything I have done for you? I gave her one final fleeting opportunity to choose loyalty over greed. I gave her the chance to remember the decades of love, the sacrifices, and the unwavering protection I had provided since the day she was born. I watched her eyes searching for even a microscopic trace of hesitation or guilt. There was absolutely none. She tightened her crossed arms, her posture stiffening, defensive and proud. Dad, it is Derek's house now, she said, her voice dripping with an icy, detached logic. We are billionaires now. Well, close enough to it. Our entire reality has changed in the last 5 minutes. We cannot have you dragging us down with your endless complaining and your depressing, outdated lifestyle. We are moving forward, and you simply do not fit into the picture anymore. Do not make this into a massive theatrical tragedy. We will send an Uber to take you to a cheap motel down the highway. You can figure the rest out tomorrow. Her betrayal was absolute. It was not a reluctant concession to her husband. It was an active, eager participation in my disposal. She was tossing me into the gutter with the exact same casual indifference she would use to discard a piece of junk mail. The absolute lack of empathy confirmed everything Jonathan and I had discussed in the corporate law office. They were both predators, and they both deserved the catastrophic destruction that was about to fall squarely on their heads. I stood there for a long moment, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the living room. I wanted them to feel the absolute peak of their arrogant triumph. I wanted them to savor the magnificent altitude of their $95 million pedestal before I ripped the foundation completely out from under them. I did not move toward the stairs. I did not turn toward the front door. Instead, I slowly walked over to the small, polished side table where I had set my ceramic mug earlier in the evening. I picked up the mug, my movements relaxed and incredibly deliberate. I raised the rim to my lips and took a slow, measured sip of the lukewarm, bitter coffee. I swallowed, letting the quiet clink of the ceramic mug against the wooden table punctuate the heavy silence in the room. Derek glared at me, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Did you not hear a single word I just said?" He shouted, stepping closer, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. "I told you to get out of my house." I turned to face him, my expression perfectly serene. The frail, exhausted old man was completely gone. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back, dropping the protective disguise I had worn for months. I looked at the colorful piece of paper trembling in his clenched fist. The winning ticket. His golden passport to absolute freedom. Before I pack my bags, "Derek," I said, my voice smooth, deep, and chillingly calm, "I need you to answer a very simple question." He paused, clearly confused by the sudden dramatic shift in my demeanor. "What kind of stupid question?" he snapped, his grip tightening on the golden ticket. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, locking my eyes directly onto his. "I want you to think very carefully about your trip to the corner gas station 10 minutes ago," I said, my words flowing like freezing water. "Tell me, Derek, which exact credit card did you use to buy that specific lottery ticket at the Texaco station?" The question hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Derek frowned, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He looked down at the ticket in his hand, then back up at my face. "What does it matter what card I used?" he spat, though a faint, almost microscopic tremor of uncertainty suddenly flickered in his eyes. "It matters more than you can possibly comprehend," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Because if my memory serves me correctly, your personal bank accounts are completely frozen, and your personal credit cards are entirely maxed out by your underground betting syndicates. You do not have a single dollar to your name. So I will ask you one more time. Did you use the black corporate expense card linked to the Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company?" Derek stood frozen. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. The $95 million ticket rustled slightly in his trembling hand. He did not know exactly what I had done, but the absolute terrifying certainty in my voice told him that his perfect, invincible world was about to violently collapse. Derek stared at me, the brief flash of uncertainty in his eyes quickly swallowed by his towering, unearned arrogance. He let out a sharp, dismissive bark of laughter, shaking his head as if I had just asked him the most absurd question in the world. He looked down at the black plastic card protruding from his wallet, then back up at me with a look of pure, condescending pity. "I used the Apex corporate card," he said, his voice dripping with venomous mockery. "The company is going to have $1 million in its account by Friday morning. A $20 lottery purchase is essentially a rounding error. Why do you even care, old man? It is not your money, and it is certainly not your company. You are just a squatter in a house that I now control. Now stop wasting my time with your pathetic interrogations and get out of my sight before I physically throw you through the front door." He turned his back on me, raising the winning ticket toward the light of the chandelier, as if to admire a priceless masterpiece. Melanie laughed from the sofa, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the vaulted living room. I did not raise my voice. I did not move toward the door. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my worn denim jacket. My fingers wrapped around the thick, heavy stack of legal documents I had been carrying since I left Jonathan Pierce's office. I slowly pulled the dense, notarized folder from my coat. I took 3 measured steps toward the center of the kitchen and brought the heavy stack of paper down onto the polished granite island. The sharp, violent smack of the thick folder striking the stone countertop echoed through the house like a gunshot. The sound was so sudden, so incredibly loud, that Derek physically jumped, spinning back around to face me. The triumphant smirk vanished from his lips, replaced by a deep, sudden apprehension. I rested my right hand flat against the crisp white cover of the legal documents. "I care, Derek, because you made a catastrophic, unforgivable miscalculation when you decided to steal my wealth," I said, my voice carrying the absolute crushing weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. "You believed that because I wear work boots and do not understand your sophisticated financial jargon, I was completely defenseless. You thought you could simply forge my signature, steal my pristine credit history, and register a corporate shell company in my name without me ever discovering your deception. You were so incredibly desperate to hide your miserable credit score and your massive gambling debts from the state regulators that you used my exact social security number to establish the foundational documents of your little scam. You handed me the absolute legal authority over the entire operation." Derek stepped back, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically toward the folder on the granite counter. "You are bluffing, Sida," he stammered, his voice losing its confident resonance. "You do not know what you are talking about." I tapped my index finger against the notarized seal on the top page. "I spent the entire day yesterday sitting in the corner office of a highly aggressive corporate attorney." I continued, my words flowing with merciless precision. "We pulled the articles of incorporation. We pulled the state registry. And as of last Friday, my legal team officially verified and legally established that I am the sole 100% owner of Apex Holdings, LLC. I am the exclusive managing member. I control the banking infrastructure, and I control every single asset registered under that corporate umbrella. You are absolutely nothing, Derek. You are an unauthorized individual who illegally accessed my corporate accounts." I watched the blood drain from his face. His skin turned a translucent shade of white as the monumental gravity of his own stupidity finally breached his arrogant defenses. He looked down at the black credit card in his wallet, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Melanie stood up from the sofa, her hands trembling as she sensed the sudden violent shift in the power dynamic of the room. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His mind was desperately trying to calculate a way out of a trap that was already locked firmly around his throat. I did not give him a chance to recover. I stepped closer, closing the distance until I was standing merely a few feet away from his trembling frame. "Let me explain a very basic fundamental principle of corporate law to you, Derek," I said, my tone incredibly quiet, but echoing with undeniable authority. "It is a concept that a brilliant financial mind like yours should have easily remembered before you swiped that card at the corner gas station. Any asset, any property, and any financial instrument purchased using corporate funds is the exclusive, undisputed property of that specific corporation. It does not matter who physically swiped the card. It does not matter who physically holds the receipt in their sweaty hand. If corporate capital was utilized to finalize the transaction, the corporation owns the resulting asset in its entirety." Derek stared at me, his eyes wide and completely terrified. The hand holding the lottery ticket was shaking so violently that the colorful paper vibrated in the air. He tried to take a step backward, but his legs seemed unable to support his weight. He bumped into the edge of the kitchen island, his knuckles turning white as he braced himself against the cold stone. Melanie let out a quiet, terrified whimper, covering her mouth with both hands, as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. She looked at her husband, expecting him to fight back, expecting him to deploy some clever legal maneuver to save their stolen fortune. But Derek had absolutely nothing left to offer. He was a completely empty shell of a man, stripped of his arrogance and exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of his own monumental failure. He had built an elaborate, deceitful labyrinth to ruin my life, and he had blindly walked himself into the dead center of the maze. I looked at the trembling ticket, then looked directly into the panicked, devastated eyes of my son-in-law. "That means that the transaction you executed 10 minutes ago was a legitimate corporate purchase," I said, delivering the final crushing blow with unyielding clarity. "You used the Apex Holdings expense account. You used my money, and therefore, by the uncompromising laws of this state, that $95 million winning ticket belongs entirely and legally to me." I extended my right hand slowly toward his chest, keeping my palm completely flat and wide open. The suffocating silence in the room was entirely absolute, broken only by the ragged, desperate sound of his shallow, frantic breathing. I watched the very last remaining fragments of his pathetic pride shatter into a million irreparable pieces. "Hand the ticket over to me right now, Derek," I commanded, my voice completely devoid of any mercy. "Do not make me call the federal authorities today to arrest you for theft." The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on our shoulders. Derek stared at my outstretched hand, his chest rising and falling in rapid, jagged motions. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation was finally tearing through the thick walls of his ego. Suddenly, the paralysis broke. A guttural sound of pure panic tore from his throat. He lunged forward, throwing his weight against the polished granite of the kitchen island. He desperately snatched the heavy notarized folder I had placed on the counter. His trembling fingers tore at the heavy white paper, frantically flipping through the legal affidavits, the certified declarations of ownership, and the bank authorizations. His eyes scanned the crisp black text, darting back and forth across the undeniable proof of his own destruction. He was reading the exact legal mechanisms that Jonathan Pierce and I had constructed to entirely sever his connection to the corporate entity. Derek dropped the heavy folder onto the granite surface. He reached into the front pocket of his linen trousers and yanked out his mobile phone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device onto the floor. He tapped the screen, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He opened the private banking application, the portal he had used just yesterday to monitor the impending $1 million collateral loan. He rapidly typed in his administrative username and his secure password, his thumb striking the glass screen with desperate force. He pressed the login button. The screen loaded for a fraction of a second before flashing a bright, glaring red banner. "Access denied. The administrative credentials have been permanently revoked." He let out a sharp, breathless gasp. He quickly closed the banking application and opened his mobile web browser. He navigated directly to the state corporate registry portal, the government database where he had fraudulently established Apex Holdings using my stolen identity. He typed his credentials into the management login field. He pressed the button. Once again, the screen flashed with an unforgiving red error message. Access denied. The master account holder has revoked all secondary access permissions. The digital fortress he had built to steal my wealth had locked him out completely. He was standing on the outside staring at a reinforced steel door that he could no longer open. Melanie took a slow, terrified step backward, pressing her shoulders against the living room wall. She looked at the flashing red screen on the mobile phone, the reality of our new dynamic finally piercing her delusion. Derek slowly lowered the phone, his breathing loud and erratic. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a manic, cornered desperation. "You stole my house using a fake quitclaim deed," I told him coldly, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "You weaponized my physical illness and manipulated my trust to steal the very roof over my head. You thought you were a brilliant financial mastermind executing the perfect, untraceable crime. But you were too stupid to use your own identity. You were too cowardly to take the actual financial risk. You built your fraudulent empire using my name, my credit history, and my social security number. You handed me the absolute legal rights to your winning ticket on a solid silver platter." Derek shook his head, taking a hesitant step back. "No," he stammered, his voice breaking. "That is my ticket. I bought it. I picked the numbers. You cannot just take it from me." "I did not take it from you, Derek," I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "You gave it to my corporation when you decided to use the Apex Holdings expense card to fund your gambling habit. You used corporate capital to secure a $95 million asset. By the strict definitions of corporate law, the ticket belongs to the company. And because I am the sole verified owner of that company, the ticket belongs entirely to me. If you try to walk into the State Lottery Commission tomorrow morning and claim that prize, they will ask you for proof of purchase. The moment they cross-reference the transaction with the bank records, they will immediately see that the ticket was purchased with stolen corporate funds. The State Lottery Commission will seize the winnings for corporate fraud, and the federal authorities will arrest you for embezzlement before you can even walk out of the lobby." I kept my hand extended, waiting for him to surrender the colorful strip of paper. "You have absolutely no moves left, Derek. The $1 million collateral loan you tried to take out against my property has been permanently frozen by the county clerk. Your violent underground creditors are going to realize you do not have their money. Your entire fraudulent scheme has collapsed. Hand me the ticket." The sheer devastation in his eyes slowly began to morph into something else entirely. The paralyzing shock evaporated, replaced by a dark, volatile rage. The realization that he had lost everything, that the $95 million fortune he had held in his hands for a brief, euphoric moment was slipping through his fingers, completely unhinged him. The polished, arrogant financial broker vanished. He was a cornered animal, desperate and wildly dangerous. He crumpled the winning lottery ticket in his right fist, holding it tightly against his chest, as if his sheer willpower could reverse the catastrophic damage. He balled his left hand into a tight, white-knuckled fist, the knuckles popping audibly in the quiet room. The thick blue veins in his neck pulsed furiously against his skin. He bared his teeth, letting out a low, guttural snarl that sounded entirely inhuman and devoid of reason. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward me, closing the distance between us. He was no longer trying to outsmart me with legal loopholes or clever corporate tricks. He was ready to resort to pure, unadulterated physical violence. He was going to assault an older man, beat me into submission, and physically force me to relinquish control of the corporation. He was going to take the ticket back by force. Melanie screamed in absolute terror from the corner of the room, begging her husband to stop before he did something unforgivable. But he completely ignored her frantic pleas. He took another heavy step forward, raising his clenched fist high into the air, his eyes fixed on my face with absolute murderous intent. I did not step backward. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I maintained my ground, looking at him with absolute unwavering calm. I reached into my left pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. My thumb rested gently over a single pre-programmed icon on the illuminated screen. "You really are a predictable fool, Derek," I said softly. I pressed the button. Instantly, the quiet darkness of the suburban street outside my home was violently shattered. Brilliant, blinding flashes of red and blue light erupted through the large bay windows, painting the kitchen walls in chaotic, strobing colors. The piercing wail of multiple police sirens cut through the night air, signaling the absolute end of his miserable reign. The heavy oak front door of my home did not simply open. It was violently breached. A team of Austin police officers surged through the entryway, their heavy tactical boots thundering against the polished hardwood floors, instantly shattering the suffocating tension that had gripped the living room. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the large bay windows, painting the walls and ceilings in a chaotic, strobing display of inescapable reality. The sheer, overwhelming volume of their sudden presence completely neutralized the dangerous, feral aggression that had just contorted Derek's face. He froze in his tracks, his raised fist dropping to his side, his mouth falling open in a pathetic display of utter, uncomprehending shock. I did not move an inch from my position. I kept my hands resting in my pockets, my breathing perfectly steady, radiating calm, absolute authority. I watched the scene unfold with the detached precision of an architect observing the controlled demolition of a condemned building. The flashing lights illuminated the absolute terror, washing over my son-in-law, replacing the violent predator with a panicked coward. He looked frantically from the officers to my face, entirely unable to process the swift reversal of his fortunes. I had not called emergency services in a moment of sudden panic. The button I pressed on my mobile phone was merely a silent, prearranged signal. I had spent the earlier part of the afternoon sitting in Jonathan Pierce's downtown law office, systematically laying out the meticulous groundwork for this precise moment. Jonathan had formally filed an extensive portfolio of criminal charges with the district attorney and the Austin Police Department hours ago. We had provided them with the forged incorporation documents, the digital logs of the unauthorized corporate banking access, and the irrefutable evidence of the fraudulent $1 million collateral loan attempt. The authorities recognized the extreme predatory nature of the financial crimes. They had stationed cruisers just down the street, waiting patiently, in the suburban shadows, for my signal to initiate the arrest. They knew Derek was dangerous, desperate, and entirely unaware of the trap that had been expertly closed around him. Derek tried to take a clumsy retreating step backward, raising his hands in a futile, trembling gesture of surrender. But the lead officers moved with ruthless, practiced efficiency. They shouted clear, deafening commands, completely drowning out Melanie's hysterical, piercing screams. Two heavily armored officers grabbed Derek by the shoulders, spinning him around with a sudden, overwhelming force that knocked the breath out of his lungs. They forcefully shoved him forward, driving his chest and face directly down onto the cold, hard surface of the kitchen island. There was an incredible poetic justice in that physical impact. Derek's cheek was pressed brutally against the very same polished granite countertop that he had arrogantly claimed to own just 10 minutes earlier. The island where he had stood, sipping imported wine, boasting about his immense unearned wealth, and planning my absolute ruin, was now the exact stage of his complete physical subjugation. He let out a muffled, pathetic groan as the officers pinned his arms firmly behind his back. The sharp, satisfying metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the kitchen, a sound that officially marked the termination of his fraudulent empire. The lead detective, a tall man with a stern, unforgiving expression, stepped forward and looked down at Derek's pinned, sweating face. He recited the criminal charges with a cold, clinical detachment that matched the severity of the offenses. Derek was formally placed under arrest for first-degree felony wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder financial exploitation. The detective explained that the magnitude of the attempted real estate theft and the interstate nature of the loan application elevated the crimes to a federal level. Derek was facing decades in a federal penitentiary, a devastating reality that was finally penetrating the thick, delusional fog of his monumental arrogance. Melanie collapsed onto the leather sofa, weeping uncontrollably. Her entire world, built entirely on the fragile foundation of her husband's deceit, was instantly vaporized. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging for an intervention, for a fatherly rescue that she had explicitly rejected just moments before. I offered her absolutely no comfort. I did not look away. I allowed her to sit in the wreckage of her own terrible choices. She had actively participated in my planned eviction. She had chosen the allure of stolen millions over the loyalty of the father who had raised her. She was now forced to watch the brutal, unyielding consequences of that betrayal unfold in real time. As the officers secured the restraints, Derek began to thrash weakly against the granite countertop. He twisted his neck, his eyes wide and completely unhinged, glaring at me with a mixture of hatred and absolute desperation. He was still clutching the $95 million lottery ticket tightly in his right fist, refusing to let go of the paper that represented his shattered fantasy. A secondary officer stepped forward, firmly prying Derek's trembling fingers apart, one by one. Derek let out a hoarse, desperate cry as the officer extracted the colorful, crumpled strip of paper from his grasp. The ticket, purchased with stolen funds from a corporate account he had illegally accessed, was officially logged as physical evidence of the ongoing financial embezzlement. The lead detective turned away from the island and walked toward me. He held the crumpled ticket carefully by the edges. He looked at the legal documents I had previously placed on the kitchen counter, verifying the official notarized corporate ownership affidavits that explicitly proved my absolute uncontested control of Apex Holdings, LLC. He nodded respectfully, acknowledging my verified status as the sole legal proprietor of the purchasing account. Without a single word of hesitation, the detective extended his hand and presented the $95 million ticket directly to me. I reached out my hand, perfectly steady, and took the small, vibrant piece of paper. It felt weightless, yet it carried the immense, undeniable gravity of absolute victory. I smoothed the crumpled edges with my thumb, feeling the satisfying texture of a fortune that had been secured through flawless, uncompromising strategy. The officers hauled Derek forcefully to his feet, dragging him away from the granite island. His legs were entirely useless, buckling beneath his weight as they marched him toward the open front door. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the tears streaming down his face. He twisted his body wildly, fighting against the relentless grip of the police officers, screaming my name in a hoarse, feral display of complete psychological breakdown. His arrogant facade was completely obliterated, leaving nothing but a ruined, pathetic criminal screaming into the cold night air. He was hauled out of the house, his desperate cries echoing down the quiet suburban street, until he was violently shoved into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut instantly, silencing his pathetic noise. I stood alone in the center of my kitchen, holding the $95 million ticket, completely victorious, ready to rebuild my life without the toxic burden of their treacherous presence. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded as the police cruisers pulled away from the curb, leaving the house in a stark, unsettling silence. I stood motionless in the center of the kitchen, the $95 million lottery ticket resting safely inside the breast pocket of my jacket. The chaotic energy that had consumed the room moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, ringing stillness. I slowly turned my attention back to the living room. Melanie was still huddled on the edge of the expensive leather sectional sofa. She looked completely shattered. Her perfectly manicured hands were trembling uncontrollably, and her immaculate designer dress was wrinkled and disheveled from the frantic commotion of her husband being hauled away in steel handcuffs. The glorious illusion of her sudden wealth and her supposedly perfect marriage had completely vanished in the span of 10 agonizing minutes. She was staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor, precisely at the spot where Derek had dropped his imported beer bottle. The crushed amber glass was still scattered across the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, a fitting monument to the total destruction of their arrogant plans. I did not speak. I simply watched her, allowing the crushing weight of reality to settle heavily over her shoulders. She slowly raised her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were red and swollen, brimming with tears of panic and self-pity. The cold, detached entitlement she had displayed when Derek ordered me out of the house was completely erased. She was no longer the arrogant billionaire heiress ready to discard her burdensome father. She was suddenly a desperate, terrified woman who had just watched her entire future collapse into smoking ruins. She slid off the edge of the sofa and dropped heavily to her knees. The movement was deliberately theatrical, a pathetic, calculated attempt to elicit sympathy from the man she had so casually betrayed minutes prior. She crawled forward on the hardwood floor, completely ignoring the sharp shards of broken glass, until she was kneeling just a few feet away from where I stood. Tears began to stream down her pale face in thick, continuous rivers. Her chest heaved with loud, dramatic sobs that echoed miserably through the quiet house. "Dad," she choked out, her voice trembling with a perfectly manufactured fragility. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry. You have to believe me right now." I did not know what Derek was doing behind closed doors. I had absolutely no idea he was committing corporate fraud or stealing your identity to fund his miserable gambling addiction. He manipulated me, Dad. He lied to me every single day, just like he lied to you. He told me everything he was doing was perfectly legal, that he was simply securing our long-term future. You know how incredibly convincing he can be. You know exactly how he talks. I was just a naive, trusting victim in his terrible scheme. Please, you have to find it in your heart to forgive me. We are family, Dad. You are my father, and I am your only daughter. We can move past this horrible nightmare. You have $95 million now, plus the entire corporation. We have more money than we could ever possibly spend in a lifetime. We can hire the absolute best defense lawyers. We can fix all of this legal mess, and we can finally be a real family again. Just you and me, Dad. Please do not do this to me tonight. Do not shut me out in the cold. I looked down at her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, hollow disappointment. The natural paternal instinct to reach out to gently comfort her, to wipe away her bitter tears, had been permanently and irreversibly extinguished. I had spent my entire adult life working tirelessly to provide for her, to protect her, and to ensure she never had to face the harsh realities of the world. And in return for my lifelong devotion, she had actively chosen to participate in my execution. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the icy, impenetrable calm settle deep into my chest. "You are lying." "Melanie," I said, my voice completely flat, resonating with a cold, absolute certainty. "You knew exactly what he was doing every step of the way. You knew his private accounts were frozen. You knew he was drowning in illegal gambling debts, and you fully supported his malicious plan to steal this house from me using a fraudulent quit-claim deed. You stood right there, in that exact spot by the sofa, while he aggressively ordered me to pack my bags and leave my own home. You watched him threaten to physically throw me out onto the street like a worthless, discarded stray dog. You did not shed a single tear for me then. You did not beg your husband for mercy on my behalf. You simply crossed your arms and coldly offered to call me an Uber to a cheap, run-down motel down the highway. Family protects each other, Melanie. Family does not stand by silently while their father is robbed, humiliated, and permanently discarded. You had a defining choice to make tonight, and you made it with absolute ruthless clarity. You consciously chose your side. You chose the dazzling illusion of unearned money over your own flesh and blood. And now you are going to live with the devastating consequences of that choice for the rest of your life. She stared up at me in stunned silence, her mouth opening and closing repeatedly as she desperately searched for another emotional manipulation, another hollow excuse to shield herself from the blinding truth. But there were simply no more excuses left to deploy. I reached deep into my jacket and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of heavy paper. It was not a lottery ticket, and it was certainly not a corporate deed. I had instructed Jonathan Pierce to draft this document 2 days ago, immediately after my legal team uncovered Derek's massive real estate fraud. I unfolded the paper and held it out toward her trembling hands. She hesitated, her fingers shaking wildly, as she slowly reached up to take the document from my steady grasp. She looked down at the bold text printed across the top of the page. It was an official 30-day notice of eviction notarized and effective immediately upon delivery. However, I was not going to give her 30 days to linger in my home. "I am terminating your residency at this address," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "I have a private security team waiting in a vehicle parked at the end of the street. They are walking up the driveway to the front door right now. You have exactly 30 minutes to go upstairs, pack whatever clothing you can fit into 2 suitcases, and vacate these premises. If you stubbornly refuse to leave when the timer expires, the security team will physically remove you for criminal trespassing. The $95 million belongs safely to my corporation, and this house belongs exclusively to me. You have absolutely nothing left here." The private security contractors were polite but entirely unyielding. They stood in the foyer, their sheer physical presence a massive, undeniable wall that blocked any further attempt at argument or manipulation. Melanie sobbed hysterically as she stumbled up the grand staircase, dragging her feet as if the physical weight of her ruined life was actively pulling her down. I remained downstairs, sipping my lukewarm coffee, listening to the frantic opening and closing of drawers, the hasty zipping of luggage, and the desperate muffled cries echoing from the master bedroom. I calmly walked into the kitchen, picked up a fresh rag, and began wiping the granite countertop where Derek had been pinned by the officers. I scrubbed away the sweat and fingerprints he had left behind, reclaiming my physical space with every deliberate motion. Exactly 30 minutes later, the security professionals escorted her back down to the ground floor. She wheeled 2 heavy suitcases behind her. Her mascara completely ruined her posture, broken. She paused at the front door, looking over her shoulder one last time, desperately hoping for a miraculous reprieve. I simply turned my back and looked out the window. The heavy oak door clicked shut, severing my ties to my deceitful daughter permanently. The subsequent months moved with a swift, brutal, and cleansing efficiency. The complex legal machinery that Jonathan Pierce had set into motion operated flawlessly, systematically, dismantling the fraudulent empire Derek had attempted to build. The criminal trial was a remarkably short, entirely one-sided affair. Confronted with the overwhelming digital evidence, the forged corporate registrations, and the documented wire fraud, Derek's court-appointed defense attorney strongly advised him to take a plea deal. He stood in the courtroom, stripped of his expensive Italian suits, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The presiding judge handed down a definitive sentence of 12 years in a federal penitentiary, citing the uniquely egregious nature of the elder financial exploitation. Derek did not look back as he was led out of the quiet courtroom in heavy shackles. Melanie's downward descent was equally precipitous and unsparing. Without Derek's illegal gambling income and the massive fraudulent loans he had relied upon, her glamorous lifestyle evaporated overnight. The lavish credit card debt they had irresponsibly accumulated, a staggering $85,000 spent on designer clothes, luxury vacations, and expensive dining, suddenly fell entirely onto her shoulders. She was forced to completely abandon her comfortable suburban illusions and move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. To avoid immediate bankruptcy, she took on 2 separate, grueling minimum-wage jobs, working incredibly long hours just to cover the suffocating monthly interest payments. She sent me numerous handwritten letters filled with desperate apologies and thinly veiled requests for financial assistance. I instructed my lawyers to return every single envelope unopened. I also finalized a new, legally impenetrable will with Jonathan. Melanie was entirely written out of my estate. She would not receive a single dime of the fortune she had so eagerly tried to steal. With the toxic elements permanently excised from my daily life, I finally turned my attention to the $95 million winning ticket. The complex process of claiming the massive Mega Millions jackpot was handled with absolute discretion by Jonathan Pierce and a specialized team of trusted financial advisors. The State Lottery Commission formally recognized Apex Holdings as the legitimate purchasing entity, officially verifying my sole ownership of the overarching corporation. The immense funds were legally transferred into my highly secure accounts, establishing a staggering level of wealth that most ordinary people could only vaguely comprehend. However, I had absolutely no underlying desire to live the flamboyant, hollow lifestyle that Derek and Melanie had so greedily coveted. I did not purchase a sprawling waterfront mansion, nor did I buy a ridiculous fleet of exotic sports cars. At my advanced age, superficial material extravagance held absolutely no appeal. Instead, I focused my enormous newfound resources on a singular, deeply personal mission. I established a massive, heavily funded charitable organization named the Sarah Caldwell Legal Defense Fund, dedicating it entirely to the loving memory of my late wife. Sarah had always been a fierce, uncompromising advocate for the vulnerable, and I knew exactly how she would have wanted me to utilize this miraculous fortune. The Foundation's primary objective was to aggressively combat the specific type of treachery I had personally endured. I proudly retained Jonathan Pierce as the lead executive director, employing a formidable team of ruthless, highly skilled trial attorneys. We provided free top-tier legal representation to elderly individuals who were actively facing financial abuse, psychological manipulation, or property theft at the hands of their own predatory children. The Defense Fund quickly became a terrifying, unstoppable force in the legal community, systematically dismantling abusive guardianships, reversing fraudulent property transfers, and holding greedy relatives criminally accountable for their abhorrent actions. The vast money that Derek had selfishly intended to use for his own personal gratification was now actively destroying cruel predators just like him across the entire state. As the passing months gradually turned into a full calendar year, the chaotic noise of the ordeal finally faded into a distant, entirely manageable memory. I spent my days actively managing the charitable foundation, finding immense satisfaction in the tangible, life-changing victories our legal team secured for desperate, vulnerable clients. But my absolute favorite moments were the quiet ones, the peaceful hours spent exactly where I had always intended to spend them. I stepped out onto the wide porch of the very house I had built with my own hands and aggressively defended against those who sought to steal it. I eased myself into the sturdy rocking chair, savoring the rhythmic creak of the runners against the floorboards. The Texas air was warm, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and dry earth. I watched the sun dip below the distant horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange, deep purple, and rich crimson. I had faced the absolute worst of human greed, staring down betrayal from my own flesh and blood, emerging completely victorious. I took a slow, deep breath, deeply grateful for the quiet strength I had found when it mattered, most perfectly content in the unyielding truth that justice had finally been served. True wealth is not measured by the numbers in a bank account, but by the integrity with which you live your life. Greed is a blinding poison that makes people underestimate the quiet strength of those they deem weak. Never mistake a father's patience for foolishness, and never assume that age erases wisdom. When you try to build your success on a foundation of deception and betrayal, you are only digging your own grave. Family is a privilege earned through respect and loyalty, not a weapon to be used for exploitation. In the end, the truth always collects its debts. Did this story resonate with you? Have you ever dealt with a toxic family member who mistook your kindness for weakness? Please share your experience in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice, revenge, and standing your ground. Stay strong.